Okay, so we are recording. So welcome to our first virtual class of going over the 1 to 4 family. When we do this in person, we tie it to a scenario where we have a scenario and we actually fill in the blanks based on the scenario. But because of the way that we're doing this, we're actually just going to go through the contract. We're going to go through the contract, look at the provisions, talk about some of the issues that we run into from time to time in those provisions, and that's how we're going to do it. So we've got 2.5 hours. We've got till 8 o'clock to go through everything. I think we will probably stop and take a break right around 6:45, about halfway through, just because, sitting in front of the screen for a long period of time. Of course, since it's not CE, you can come and go as you please. It's not that you have to be on the entire time. It's entirely up to you. If you want to get up and walk around or do whatever you need to do, then of course, feel free, because it is not, like I said, it's not CE this time. I'm hoping that we can get to the point to where we can do it that way, but for now, it's not. So, all right. So let's go ahead and take a look at our 1 to 4 family contract. So very first thing that we always look at is the date. In this case, you see that the date is November the 4th, 2024. That is the last version of the contract. That's the latest version of the contract, and we're only allowed to use the latest version, the most recent version. If you try to use anything other than the one that is currently promulgated, then it is considered the unauthorized practice of law, and that'll get you in trouble. And so you want to make sure that if you're writing the offer, you want to make sure that you write it on the right contract form. If you receive an offer on an old contract form, then don't work it. Because if you start working an offer that comes in on the wrong contract form, then you could be conceivably looked at as practicing law as well. So you don't want to do that. If it's on the wrong form, send it back, ask them to put it on the correct form, and then we can go ahead and move forward. It's not really much of an issue right now because this one's been out long enough that everybody has gotten used to using it. The next version of the contract will probably come out in June of this year. It looks like they're going to make some changes again, just like they do every couple of years. Looks like they're going to be making some more changes. And that, so of course, when that happens, what's going to normally happen is that there will be this transition period between the time where we can still continue to use this one, or we can use the new one, either one. And usually that transition period is 60 to 90 days. But there will be a point where it will be a drop dead date where they will say, okay, from this point on, you can no longer use the old one. But that's probably coming in about June. So, of course, you see this contract, the 1 to 4 family residential contract for resale properties. New homes have their own promulgated forms, although most of the time, most builders also have their own forms that they want to use. And so the use of the new home promulgated contract forms pretty rare. I can tell you in my 42 years that I have done maybe half a dozen transactions on new homes where they allowed the use of our contract form. Builders don't like our contract forms. They like theirs because everything is skewed in their favor. And so they don't really care for ours too much. But this contract can be used on single family, duplex, triplex, and a fourplex, and it can also be used on townhomes. It cannot be used on condominiums, just like it says, not for condominium transactions, because condominiums is a different type of transaction that does not include the sale of land. So in all the other ones, townhome, single family, duplex, triplex, fourplex, it also includes the sale of the land that the structure sits on. In condominiums, it does not. So that's why they have their own contract form. And I know it's hard sometimes to tell whether or not the property, whether or not the structure is actually a townhome or a condo. And sometimes even the tax record doesn't help that much. But what I have found, one of the ways to tell is look at the tax record and see what the land value is. If you look at the assessed value of the property, it's broken out into two different sections. There is the improvement section and there is the land section. And if land value says 0, then it's probably most likely going to be a condominium. So that's one way to tell. Sometimes in the legal description, you can also tell. If the legal description says unit number, building number, then that's a condominium. That is not a townhome. So there are several ways of doing it. So our very first section talks about the who, and of course the parties are buyer and seller. You and I as real estate agents are not a party to the contract. We don't show up actually anywhere on the contract form itself. There is a page for us, page 10 of the contract, which is actually not part of the contract. It's called an acknowledgement page. There is a place for us to put our names, but they are very clear on page 10, and they say, do not sign this contract. They don't want us signing the contract form because we're not a part of it. So, oops, sorry. Let me move something around here so we can get there. So. Okay. Sorry about that. Lost my page there for a second. So, all right. So our parties again, buyer and seller. So the seller, of course, right now the contract form only allows for 2 spaces, only allows for 2 sellers. Hopefully that's one of the changes they're talking about making, to where the contract will actually include enough space for 4 people. And especially on the purchase side. On the seller side, we see that from time to time, but we really see it sometimes now in the purchase side, where we talk about multi-generational living, where families go together and they have maybe kids and parents buying property together. So hopefully they're going to go to where there are 4 spaces here instead of just 2. Seller agrees to sell and convey to buyer. Buyer agrees to buy from seller. That is a promise for a promise. At this point, seller is promising to sell the property to the buyer. Buyer is promising to buy it from the seller. So promises have value, but probably not enough value to carry this transaction through. So that's where we start looking at earnest money, and we'll see that in section 5. When we look at earnest money, of course, is a show of good faith. It's not the consideration in the contract. This promise is actually what creates the contract. Section 2, property, is going to talk about what is going to be sold by the seller and what's going to be purchased by the buyer. And we start out with the land. The assumption is that this is going to be a property in a subdivision in a community where the legal description is lot and block. So there's a place for the lot number, place for the block number, and then after that, that long space afterwards is where we put the section and the name of the community, the name of the subdivision. Not all legal descriptions are going to be lot and block. It could be meets and bounds, but typically in this regular residential contract, that's what it's going to be, lot and block. The second line, city of. If the property is located inside of a city limits, then of course you put that city in there. If it's not inside of city limits, then we use the mailing destination. So there's a lot of property around Houston that is not actually in a city, not in the city of Houston or not in any city, but it receives mail. And so we use that city where they receive mail. Example, Cypress. There is no city of Cypress. There is no such community as Cypress. There used to be a city of Cypress years and years ago, but not anymore. But it's still a mailing destination. And so we can go ahead, we can use whatever the mailing destination is. County of, whatever the county happens to be, Harris, Waller, Montgomery, whatever the county happens to be, then that's going to be what we put in there. Sorry, I'm still admitting people here.
Don, I got a question.
Yes, sir. And yeah, fine. And you guys have questions, just jump right in, because probably they'll be pertinent to what we're talking about right then. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Russ.
On paragraph 1, as far as the parties, is there certain verbiage you would use for either power of attorney or trust in there?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because we run into that. So if it's the seller, if it's a trust, then usually the name of the trust is going to be the seller. So here is not really where we start seeing changing names and things like that. If it's the trust that is selling the property, then the trust is who the seller is. The signature is going to be different, but the name here will be whatever the trust is. Or if somebody's signing as power of attorney, also, you still have the regular names, but then the signature is what's probably going to be different.
Okay.
Yeah. On section 2A, third line, known as, we have this long line. Two things are going to go there: street address and zip code. And that's it. That's all that's going to go there. B, and when we talk about B and C, let's go ahead and run that down a little bit. When we talk about B and C, now what we're talking about is the other parts besides the land, the other things that are going to be included in the sale of the property. I like to make sure, I don't care which side of the transaction I'm on, buyer or seller, I want them to read through that, because I want to try to make it as clear as possible to both sides of the transaction what exactly is going to stay with the property, because that's what B and C is. The improvements and the accessories, these are all things that are supposed to remain with the property. And if it's something that the seller wants to take with them, then they can list it in D. But first, I want them to read through B and C and then ask that question, if it's the seller, is there anything here in this list that we need to exclude or reserve, that we need to pull out? And if so, then we would want to list it there. If it's not there, then it's going to be considered part of the sale. So we want to make sure that it's there. If we're not sure if it's something we should exclude or reserve, go ahead and put it in there, because it's better to put too much in there than not enough. Because if you put too much in there, somebody might say, okay, fine, refrigerator, washer, and dryer, we knew you were going to take those. You didn't need to put that in there. I'd rather put it in there than not. Just if you go one way or the other, I would go ahead. I would rather put too much in there than not enough. And then E, reservations. This has to do with minerals most of the time in regular residential real estate. We're not going to run into that as an issue. We're not going to have mineral rights that we're going to need to negotiate. But if we do, then the way that we're going to negotiate that is through an addendum. And the addendum is called the reservation of oil, gas, and other minerals. Without that addendum, whatever the seller owns in the way of mineral rights are going to be conveyed to the buyer. That's the default position of the contract. Whatever the seller owns in the way of mineral rights are going to be conveyed to the buyer. If the seller wants to keep some or all of the mineral rights that they currently own, then they need to do that addendum. But again, probably not going to run into that very much. Section 3, sales price. First part of that, a cash portion of the sales price payable by the buyer at closing. We know that is down payment. So whatever the down payment's going to be that the buyer plans on putting, that's what we're going to put in there. And then they added some language underneath there where it says the term cash portion of the sales price does not include proceeds from borrowing of any kind. And the reason they added that in there is because some people and some agents, when they were writing up hard money offers where they were using hard money, they called those cash deals. Those are not cash deals. Just because the borrowing is coming from another place and the collateral is not this property, it's still borrowing. And so this is just simply saying that if you're having to borrow this money from anywhere, then it is not considered cash portion. It's considered loan amount. It's part of the second block, which is loan amount. And then the other part, selling other real property except as disclosed in this contract. And the reason they added that in there is because some agents got the bright idea, and this happened mostly in 2021, first half of 2022, when there was so much competition for the few properties that were on the market for sale. It turned out that agents got the bright idea that if they left that contingency off and tried to stretch out the time on the third-party financing addendum to like 30 days or something like that, that would give their buyer the opportunity to try to get their home, their existing home, under contract. And if it didn't go under contract within those 30 days, they weren't going to qualify for their loan, so they could get a letter of denial from their lender, and they could go ahead and get their earnest money back, even though they really needed to sell their existing property. Without putting that contingency in there, it just made the offer look stronger than it actually was. And so that's why they added that in there too. So both of those issues were taken care of by them adding that one little sentence in there. B, sum of all financing described in the attached addendum. Three choices here. Third-party financing addendum, which is where most of it comes from. That is bank, mortgage company, credit union, any place outside of the transaction. Loan assumption addendum. That would be where we are taking over an existing loan, an existing FHA or an existing VA. I haven't seen a conventional loan that was assumable in about 20 years now. So I don't think that's good. It's probably going to be either FHA or VA. Or the third option, seller financing, which would be if the property is owned free and clear, then the owner the owner might do the financing instead of an outside lender, where the seller would say, hey, just pay me the down payment, make your monthly payments to me. I'll be like the lender. I'll have all the same rights. If you don't pay me, I can foreclose on you. All the things that would be the same. In order to do seller or owner financing, though, most likely the property would have to already be free and clear. Because if they have an existing loan on it, the existing loan would have to be paid off before the seller could do any seller financing. So most likely it's going to have to be already free and clear. And then section C, sales price, sum of A and B. You take whatever's in A, take whatever's in B, add them together, and you should come up with C. If you're doing fillable forms like you see here, then it does the addition for us. So it'll already know. If you put in the down payment amount, you put in the loan amount, it will add them together and give us the sales price. Just check the sales price, make sure it's right. Because if not, then something's not right somewhere. So just need to take a look at that. The last part of this first page is leases. And this is a fairly new provision that's been added in just because, mostly solar panels. But they took the information that was in the contract somewhere else about leases, and they combined that here too. Created a couple possible addenda that might have to be attached to the contract. If the property is now subject to a residential lease, if there's a tenant in the property, then we know the lease will survive the sale. The lease will survive the sale, even though the property is sold and there's a new owner. The tenant still has the right to finish out their lease, assuming that they're living up to the terms of the lease, of course, that they're paying their rent and all that other stuff. So they do have the right to remain. So because the new owner, the buyer, will not be able to occupy that property until that lease is over, then they have to give them, the new buyer, information about how much time is left on the lease, how much the monthly rent is, how much deposit there was and going to be transferred. All of those things are going to be found in that addendum about the residential lease. B, fixture leases. Solar panels has become a big issue with a lot of properties, with a lot of listings. If the property is subject to a solar panel lease or lease to own, then we have to talk about who's going to pay the remainder of that contract. Is the seller going to pay it off out of their proceeds? Is the buyer going to assume the remainder of the cost? What's going to happen there? And so that document will go into how much there is still to pay, what the monthly payment is, who's going to pay it, is the seller going to pay it out of proceeds, or is the buyer assuming the rest? So, yeah, Maribel, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to know how, okay, for example, I have my house with lease, with solar panels. I paid the loan already. But
Okay.
if I want to sell this house, what is the best for me to deal with this part of the?
If they're current already paid off, did you say?
I didn't pay off. I pay monthly for
Oh, okay.
30 years.
Oh, okay. So if they're still under contract to be purchased, then it really becomes a negotiable item between the buyer and the seller. You can offer it however you want. You can offer the property where the seller is going to pay it off, or expect the buyer to assume. Of course, what's going to be better for any buyer would be if the seller is going to pay it off. So it's just like anything else. If the seller agrees to pay him off, then that's probably going to attract more buyers than if they leave that remainder for the buyer to pick up. That's probably going to knock some buyers out. So if they want to try to attract as many buyers as possible, they probably should pay them off, or agree to pay them off out of proceeds.
Means that, okay, for example, my house, in the market is 100, but my solar panels are 30,000. So the best for me is to increase a little bit the price, the sell price, and pay off the solar panels.
So the only thing that you need to watch out for there is appraisal. You know, if you tack it on to, if you throw another 30,000 on top of the sales price in order to have the seller pay them off, don't forget the property has to appraise. Unless it's a cash deal, property is going to have to appraise. And I can tell you from my experience, from the appraisers that I have talked to, solar panels do not add that much value to the property. When they go and do their appraisal, my experience has been that the solar panels will add $5,000 to maybe $6,000 of value. So those are depreciating assets for sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. You're welcome. No problem at all. C talks about natural resource leases. Again, if there aren't any natural resources, if there's no oil, there's no gas to really argue about, then there's probably nothing to negotiate here. Out of this section, probably either A or B is what's going to get filled out. And most time it's not going to be filled out much. So page 1, the very first page of the contract, usually we don't run into that many issues. Most of the time things are filled out properly. We don't run into usually any problems at all. The only problem that I've seen once in a while is getting the numbers flipped, where A is supposed to be down payment. Sometimes they put the loan amount. B is supposed to be loan amount. Sometimes they put down payment. But other than that, and of course that can be fixed. So that's really about all we see there. So before we go on to page 2, anybody have any other questions on this page? Are we good? All right, then we'll go on to the next page.
So Don,
Yes, sir.
on C, we have to X out something, right?
On
you
natural resource leases,
Yeah, can you leave it blank, or do you have to?
you can leave this one blank. And the reason you can leave it blank is because it's a checkbox. It's a either yes or no, and it's determined by whether or not you check the box. So if you don't check the box, then the assumption is already that it doesn't apply. So in a case like this, that you do not have to. You can leave it blank. Everything can be blank there. That's fine, because by leaving it blank, it doesn't give you the opportunity to say no. It only gives you the opportunity to say yes. And since it only gives you the opportunity to say yes, if you don't say yes, the assumption is no, it doesn't apply. In most cases, yeah, we want something in the blanks, but in a checkbox, they only give you one option, and that's either checking it or not checking it. So, all right, section 5. Section 5, this one causes quite a bit of trouble from time to time. So, and honestly, I wish that they had taken the earnest money and the termination option and made them 2 separate provisions. I think that there's enough difference between the two that they would have been fine as two separate provisions, but they added them together. So 5A, delivery of earnest money and option fee. And so, I'm sorry, let me add in whoever we got here. There we go. So the delivery of earnest money and option fee, first says within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver to, then they give us a blank for the escrow agent at some address, a certain amount of money for the earnest money, certain amount of money is the option fee. So that's one sentence and there's quite a bit there. So let's take it a little bit at a time. So within 3 days after the effective date, let's make sure we all know how to determine time based on the contract. The day the contract is signed does not count. That is not day one. The day the contract is signed is the effective date. And if you notice, it says within a certain number of days after the effective date. So if we go under contract today on a Wednesday, tomorrow is day one. Tomorrow is always day one. The way that Marty describes it is he says that the day of signing is day 0. Tomorrow is day 1. Yeah, Brittany, go ahead.
Okay, so I had a question about this. We had, and Sandy said it was something about like a setting that we had in zip forms that we needed to adjust. You know what I'm going to ask? We had a seller sign at like 9:30 that night, and the effective date, it automatically put the next day as the effective date. And so when we went back and looked, we were like, oh gosh, so is this day one, even though she signed it on Wednesday night? Is Thursday the effective date because she signed it after 9:30? Or
I'm so glad you brought that up because you're right. It's a setting. Did you use zip forms?
Yes, sir.
Especially zip forms. It's a setting in zip forms where you have to put your time zone. You have to go in and put what time zone you're in, because if you don't put the time zone that you're in, it assumes Greenwich Mean Time. And so if you signed at 9:30 p.m. and you don't have the right time zone set in the settings part of zip forms, it's going to assume Greenwich Mean Time and it's going to add 6 hours onto it. And so that's why if you did it at 9:30 tonight and you didn't have the right time zone in the settings, it's going to think it's tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm glad you brought that up because I had that happen to me once, probably 20 years ago, and could not figure out for the life of me, how in the world did it tell me that it was signed here? Because I know when it was signed, I know when it came back by my email, and it turned out it was that setting for the time zone in zip forms.
So
Okay,
Don,
sure, and go change that.
Don, with HAR, that doesn't happen. With transaction does.
I've never used it, so I don't know for sure. I would check it just to be on the safe side. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But it definitely can be a head scratcher for a while until you figure out what the heck happened. So,
I was like, I know I'm not crazy. I was like, I'm sitting right here.
right? All right. So the next part, buyer must deliver to, let's keep talking about days for a second. So every day counts. We count every single day, but the day that's going to really count the most is day 3. Where does day 3 fall? So we say we go under contract today, Wednesday, tomorrow, Thursday, day 1, Friday, day 2, Saturday's day 3. And of course, there's a place here where it says that if day 3 happens to fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then it automatically rolls to the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. I think they need to change this verbiage. I think they need to need to change it to, if day 3 falls on a day where the title company is not open, then it's going to roll to the next, because that's what they mean. But they don't take into account what we dealt with last Monday when we had a freeze going on and the title companies weren't open. The earnest money and option fee that was due by that Monday could not be delivered. And so it's kind of a gray area because they didn't cover that. The contract doesn't cover that. And so it's like, well, does it roll to Tuesday or not? Title company's not open. So I think there's talk about changing that language to say, if day 3 happens to fall on a day where the title company's not open, then it'll automatically roll to the next day. So, all right, delivered to escrow agent. We see a lot of mistakes on this one because when we think of escrow agent, we think of agent, we think of person. And so we put a person's name in there. That is not the escrow agent. The escrow agent is the title company. So do not put, and a lot of times we see title company dash your favorite closer's name. Don't do that either, because that can create a situation. What happens if that closer leaves during the time of this contract? Is the contract supposed to follow them, or does it stay at the title company? It creates an issue. So just put the title company name. If you want to designate a closer, do it somewhere else. Don't do it here. I would think if you wanted to designate a closer in special provisions, that would be acceptable. It does not change the terms of the contract. It would be a business detail. I think that would be acceptable, but don't put it here. And then, of course, there is a street address that needs to be listed here because that money may be delivered in person, and so their street address needs to be there. Next blanks, how much? How much is earnest money? How much is option fee? Negotiable. Anytime you see a blank, it tells you that it's negotiable. It can be any amount. Somewhere along the way, and I don't know where this happened, but somewhere along the way, people started getting the idea that earnest money has to be 1% of the sales price. It doesn't. If it had to be 1% of the sales price, they wouldn't make a blank. They would just say 1% of the sales price as earnest money and a certain amount is the option fee. It can be anything. You can have a valid sales contract with 0 earnest money. Not a good idea, but you can. You do not have to have earnest money. Earnest money is a show of good faith. It does not create the contract. It is just a show of good faith. So whatever the amount is, whatever the amount that gets put in there, we see it all the time, that people make it exactly 1% of whatever the sales price is. One of the last deals that I did, I don't do that much production anymore, but one of the last production deals I did, we had a property listed for $405. Offer came in at $395. And of course, they offered $3,950 as the earnest money, 1% of the offer. Well, we negotiated back and forth and back and forth. We ended up at $399.5. And so we went under contract, got everything going. 2 or 3 days into the transaction, the buyer's agent called just absolutely frantic. And I said, what's going on? She said, we made a big mistake. And I said, okay, what's the mistake that we made? She said, we didn't change the amount of earnest money. It's still $3,950, even though the sales price ended up $399.5. We didn't change the amount of earnest money. It's like, it's okay. We'll find plenty of other things to talk about. That one's fine. I don't think my sellers are going to think your buyers are any more earnest with that additional $45 that would have been paid. So it's okay. Don't worry about it. It won't cause any issues at all. So I don't know where it happened, but somewhere along the way, people started getting the idea that it absolutely, positively has to be 1%. It does not. Whatever parties agreed to. Yes, sir.
Okay. So as far as the earnest money and also the option fee, who actually is setting the price? Is it the seller?
Well, buyers writing the offer. A lot of times the listing agent, and we say listing agent because maybe in MLS, they may say what the expectations are. You know, they may say 1% earnest money and $100 a day for option. That's what they're putting out there, but that doesn't mean that's what it has to be. You can try to negotiate it if you want. The seller can't set anything. Anytime it's a blank, they can't set anything. They can tell you what they want. They may not budge off of it, but it's between, it really is negotiable between buyer and seller. If seller doesn't state anything, then the buyer offers what they offer, and either it's enough or it's not enough.
Okay.
So yeah, totally negotiable. And so option fee, how much should option fee be? Again, it's a negotiable amount. Here in recent history, we can kind of break it up into 3 different time frames: pre-COVID, COVID, and post-COVID. Because before COVID hit, it was very common to see 10 days, $100. Very typical. We'd see that an awful lot, where they would put, $10 a day. But then when COVID hit, and during that 2021, first half of 2022, when they were buyers were competing against each other, and they were doing whatever they could to make their offers look better than everybody else's, we saw the amount of option fee per day shoot way up. We saw $100 a day. We saw even more than that sometimes. And of course, they would shrink the number of days as much as they could to try to make their offer look better than everybody else's. I remember seeing times where it was $500 option fee for 3 days or for 5 days. And so it really went crazy during that time. It has now kind of settled back down to where we see usually somewhere $25 to $50 a day. It seems like somewhere in there seems to be the range that we see the most, or that I see the most on the contracts that come across my desk. So, but it's whatever, again, whatever the parties agreed to, but there does have to be money. Some dollar amount has to be in that blank. You cannot get an option period for 0. And we can even take that a step further. You cannot get an extension of an option period for 0. No matter whose fault it is that we're having to extend, just like there has to be money paid for the initial option period, there also has to be money paid for an extension of the option period, regardless of whose fault it is that we're extending. And I know sometimes it's not going to sound fair, because it may be the seller's fault that we're having to extend. Doesn't matter. Buyer still has to pay money. It's a negotiable amount, but they do still have to pay some money. So keep that in mind. Number 1 there talks about if we have any additional earnest money. We don't normally have that kind of scenario where there is an additional amount of earnest money that's going to be paid on top of the initial amount. Usually the initial amount is going to be the full amount. My wife's home, sorry. I mean, not sorry my wife's home. Sorry, the dog's barking about my wife being home. The second part talks about, oh my goodness, excuse me just a second. We're going to shut that door.
I can't even hear the dog.
Do what?
I can't even hear the dog. I think you're good.
Oh, you couldn't hear?
I don't
Oh
think
my
so.
gosh. Okay. All right. So the second one does talk about what we've already discussed. If that last day happens to fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then the time is going to roll forward automatically to the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So that is a automatic extension there. And you notice there is no time frame here. They don't put like by 5:00 p.m. on the third day of whatever day it happens to be. There is a 5:00 deadline further down here, but that has nothing to do with the money being paid. It has to do with the time to walk away. So on day 3, if you get the money there and the title company is open, congratulations, you made it. If you get there on day 3 and the title company's closed, you didn't make it. So, I mean, it's really pretty much that simple. Third part, the amount that the escrow agent, the title company, receives under this paragraph is going to be applied first to the option fee, then to the earnest money, and then the rest would go to the additional earnest money if there is. And there is a very specific reason why they credit the money that way. What they wouldn't want to happen is have a contract happen where there's enough money to cover the earnest money, but not enough money to cover the option fee. Because if I have enough money for the option or for the earnest money, then my contract's in full force. But if there's no option fee paid or not enough option fee paid, then the buyer does not have the right to walk away. That's the worst thing that could happen to a buyer, is that you have a contract with no option period, where the buyer is locked in because they got no option period. So that's why it pays the option fee first. If any money is received, it goes towards the option fee. Hopefully it'll be enough to cover at least the option fee. And if it doesn't, if it's not enough for the earnest money, then the seller has the right to walk away if they want to. So, and we'll see that here in a minute. The fourth one just gives the title company the authority to take that option fee and pass it on to the seller. That option fee does not belong to the title company. It's not theirs to keep. It's supposed to be shared or passed directly onto the seller. And they thought, when they first created that, they really thought that title companies would be handling that option fee like it was a hot potato, that as soon as they got it, they were going to take it and send it on to the seller. It hasn't turned out that way. They hang on to it and credit it back at closing and give it back to them or whatever. It's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be that when the title company receives it, that they are a conduit. It doesn't stop with them. It passes right through them and onto the seller. That's what's supposed to happen. But it doesn't seem to be happening that way sometimes. So. The next section talks about the termination option, the option period, where it says, for nominal consideration, receipt of which the seller hereby acknowledges buyer's agreement to pay the option fee within the time required, seller grants the buyer the unrestricted right to terminate this contract by giving notice of termination to the seller within X number of days after the effective date of the contract. So, of course, the blank is going to identify how many days is this option period. How much time does the buyer have to change their mind for any reason, unrestricted right to terminate? The buyer change their mind for any reason and walk away. And of course, like it says, notices, and notices mean in writing. Notices under this paragraph must be given by 5:00 p.m. Local time where the property is located by the date specified. It used to be 11:59 p.m. They changed it because everybody waits until the last minute sometimes to negotiate the repairs. And so instead of making it 11:59, they made it 5:00 p.m., which I think 11:59, yeah, that was probably a dumb time. But the only dumber time is 5:00 p.m. At 5:00 p.m., everybody is sitting in rush hour traffic and trying to get a signed termination from them while they're driving, trying to get them to electronically sign this termination by 5:00 p.m. is just crazy to me. I don't know why they didn't make it 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, something in between, but they didn't. So as crazy as it sounds, as much we don't like to talk about having a deal fall apart when it first goes under contract, I used to have my buyers sign a termination as soon as we did the contract. As soon as we went under contract, I would have them sign a termination. And I would tell them, I'm going to keep this in my file. If we get to the point where you decide you want to terminate, I've already got it ready to go and I'll send it. And that way, we won't have to worry about trying to find you. We won't have to worry about the fact that you might be sitting in traffic and you can't sign anything. That way, I've already got it. So it seemed to work well for me. You can do it however you want, but that used to work well for me. The only thing we have to keep in mind is that we don't send it until we mean it, because I've had that happen before too, where an agent will send a signed termination because the time's getting close. You know, we've got a 5 o'clock deadline It's 3:30, 3:45 in the afternoon. They're starting to get a little jittery, a little nervous on the other side. And so preemptively, they send the termination. They send this contract termination, and then they say, we're just sending this just in case. Yeah, we're not terminating now. We're just sending it just in case. Well, the problem is the termination says that we are terminating the contract. So if they send it, they have terminated it. Mahato, how you doing? Got a question?
Don, I apologize for bothering you.
No, you're not bothering me.
I don't have a question, but Karel is trying to get, she's trying to join this link. Can you let her in, please? She sent me a message.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Karel, Sarah, she's trying to join this meeting, and she asked if you could let her in.
Oh, I don't have her name. I don't see her here waiting to get in.
Okay.
I can't admit her because I don't see it.
Okay, I'll tell her to go back then, I guess.
Yeah. Tell her to go ahead and go back in and try to rejoin.
Okay.
I don't see her here.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we don't want anybody to miss out if they want to be.
Sir.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Okay. All right. So they have until 5:00 p.m. to terminate. If they don't terminate, then option period is over. Everything goes forward. And it says if the buyer does send in that termination within that time frame, then of course they get their earnest money back. They do not get their option fee back. The Real Estate Commission draws a distinction between the word refund and credit. Real Estate Commission says option fee is never, ever, ever, ever refunded. They don't ever get that same money back. Once they have paid that money to the title company for the seller, that money now belongs to the seller. It is their money. The buyer can get credit for that money if they close. But they never get their money refunded. It never comes back to them. If they close, they get credit, but they never get a refund. And so I don't know why they draw that distinction, but they do. So option fee never refunded, but it is credited if they close. So whatever the distinction is, that's what they say. C and D talks about what happens if there is not money or enough money sent to the title company. There, that sounded like maybe they were trying to get in. Okay, I think that did it. All right, so C talks about earnest money first. And a lot of people think, and it seems to happen on the buyer side, sometimes on the seller side too, but mostly on the buyer side, where the buyer thinks, if I don't send the money in, if I don't send the earnest money in, if I don't send the option fee in, then that's going to kill the deal. That's not true. It will create a scenario where maybe the deal will die, but it's not going to automatically kill it. Look at what C says. Failure to timely deliver earnest money. If the buyer fails to deliver the earnest money within the time required, seller may terminate this contract or exercise the seller's remedies under paragraph 15 or both by providing notice to the buyer before the buyer delivers the earnest money. So you see, it doesn't automatically kill the deal. All it does is it opens the door for the seller to terminate. Buyer didn't get the earnest money to the title company by the end of day 3. Beginning on day 4, the seller can terminate if they want, but they don't have to. The seller could say, that's okay, I'm good, I'm good. We can go ahead and let this deal continue through. It also says that the seller maintains that ability to terminate all the way up until the buyer does finally deliver that earnest money. So even if the buyer delivers the earnest money late, if it gets there on day 4, day 5, day 6, if the seller has not terminated by then our deal is solid and we go forward. So it gives the seller the right to terminate, but it does not kill it by itself. And then D talks about if we don't deliver the option fee. If we don't deliver the option fee, then if it says if no dollar amount is stated as the option fee, Or if the buyer fails to deliver it within the time required, then the buyer loses the option period. Still doesn't say anything about killing the contract. It's not going to kill the contract. What it's going to do is it's going to create a situation where the buyer does not have the right to walk away. And so the worst thing that can happen is what I mentioned before, where the buyer delivers no money. The buyer delivers no money to the title company. The seller chooses not to terminate the transaction, and the buyer has no right to terminate. That's the worst thing that can happen. And I know we have questions sometimes about a buyer who chooses to terminate before the 3 days. Do they still have to deliver the earnest money and the option fee? Option fee, absolutely, positively, yes. Because you don't get the right to walk away until you deliver the money. So if I'm trying to walk away and I haven't delivered the money, I'm in breach of contract. So to answer that question, absolutely, positively, yes, the buyer has to deliver the option fee and within the time allowed, or the buyer doesn't get the right to walk away. Even if they're trying to walk away on day 1, day 2, doesn't matter. They still have to deliver the option fee, because if they don't, they have the right to walk away. And so earnest money, maybe not. A lot of times that the listing side's going to say, don't bother with the earnest money. You're going to turn it in. We're going to do an earnest money release and you're going to get it back anyway. Let's just forget about that. But option fee, absolutely. Maribel, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So, for example, if I am the seller, okay, represent the seller and the buyer didn't deliver the option fee and the escrow at all, so the seller immediately cancel the contract, immediately?
It is under contract.
Yes, sign the contract and everything, but the seller didn't receive the title company didn't receive the money. It's canceled immediately.
It's not canceled. The deal is not canceled unless the seller wants it to be.
Okay, explain please, because I don't understand.
Okay, well, let's go back to C and D. If I don't deliver the earnest money, or D, if I don't deliver the option fee, neither one of those things say that if the money's not received, the transaction's dead. The transaction is still a transaction. The contract is still created. They're in breach of contract, but it doesn't kill the deal. Just because somebody's in breach of contract does not mean it automatically will kill that transaction. In this case, it says if they don't deliver the earnest money, now the seller has the right to terminate, but they don't have to. Buyer doesn't get the right to terminate because they didn't pay the money. Buyer's in the wrong. They're not going to have any rights here. It's really up to the seller if the seller wants to do it or not. And the option fee just simply means, does the buyer have the unrestricted right to terminate or not? So whether you deliver any money or not, you're still under contract.
Okay, in this case, if the seller can sue the buyer?
The seller, if they wanted to, they could. If they wanted, the buyer is in breach of contract. If the seller wanted to pursue them, they could. Most of the time they're not, because they want to get their home sold. They're not going to mess around with that, because the best they could hope for is maybe get the earnest money. They're probably not going to do that, but they are in breach of contract.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mahato, go ahead.
Yes, Don, I have a question. I had a scenario 3 years ago where I was working with a buyer and he was late. I think he did it intentionally anyway. He was late making payment for the earnest and option. And now that we were late, he ended up not even wanting to pay either or not even the option fee. So how do you handle that?
You can only advise them as to what's going to happen or what could happen if they don't. And so that's not practicing law, because it's right here in the contract. And so you can point it out to them. It's like, look, here's what could happen. If you don't deliver the earnest money, then the seller could terminate, but they might not, which means you're still under contract to buy that house. And if you don't pay the option fee, What you're losing is the right to walk away. So if you don't pay any money at all, what you're creating is a scenario for yourself that could be worst case scenario where you're under contract to buy this house and you don't have any rights to walk away. You're locked into purchasing this home. That's what it says. And you can only advise them as to what could happen. And if they absolutely positively refuse to do it, then it's on them. You've done everything you can. I would sure want to keep good notes that, hey, this is what I advised them and they did it on their own. You can give the best advice and opinion out there.
Right.
And not always going to follow it. They think they know better than you do sometimes.
Right. He was a very stubborn older man. He would not listen. And to be honest with you, I kind of felt bad for the situation. And it was like only 250. And I ended up paying it myself, just to avoid all the headache. I get you. I have done that in the past too, where I have go and delivered, because it doesn't say it has to come from the buyer. It just says that it has to get there. So yeah, I get you. I have done that before too, but yeah, you hate to have to do that. So, but I get it. Time is of the essence. In our contracts, we measure time two different ways. One is called reasonable time, and the other one is called time is of the essence. These contracts have to be flexible because there's just so many scenarios that can take place and so many situations that can occur. We need some flexibility. And most of the time, time-wise, we have some flexibility, just like the closing date. There's a date on the contract that says that it's supposed to close by such a date. But if it doesn't close on that date, it doesn't automatically kill the deal. Buyer and seller could both show up at the title company the next day and close it and everything's fine. So that's reasonable time. It says that, yeah, there is a time frame, but if you don't meet that time frame, then the consequences may not be so bad. Then you've got time is of the essence. And time is of the essence says that these time frames right now are set in stone. And if you don't hit these time frames, then there could be considerable consequences. And it even tells you what the consequences are all the way through. And so the only way, of course, of changing these timelines that are there is by an amendment between buyer and seller. If buyer and seller do an amendment to change the number of days from 3 days to 5 days, then the number of days has been changed. But they need to do that before they get to the end of the third day, because if they wait till after, then the time frame has already been hit. So it can be done. It just needs to be done at the right time and in the right way. All right, Section 6. Section 6 is title policy and survey. Probably this is the longest provision in the contract. So A talks about the title policy and who's going to pay for the title policy, and it is negotiable, either buyer or seller. In a resale, a lot of times we see the seller paying the owner title policy, and we see the buyer paying the one for the lender, the mortgagee's title policy, if there is a lender. And of course, the title policy is going to be issued by our title company. It'd be the same title company we have listed up in Section 5. Numbers 1 through 9 are what we call exceptions to title. These are things that the title company will not cover. The only one that we really need to pay attention to in filling out the contract is number 8, where there is a choice, there is a checkbox, and one box or the other does need to be checked. And it talks about whether or not we're going to ask the title company to cover more than what their basic policy covers. So the title policy says, whatever the legal description is here, lot 1, block 1, section 1 of whatever subdivision, that the title company says, our policy will guarantee clear title. We will guarantee that lot 1, block 1, section 1 of whatever subdivision this is, has clear title, no liens, no issues at all. That we will guarantee that. That's what our policy does. But we do not guarantee
that the amount of land that you are purchasing is exactly 8,250 square feet. If you want us to guarantee that, we will, but it's going to cost you more money. And so that's where we mark yes or no. If we mark that first box, we're saying no, we don't want that additional coverage, that we're just going to let it go like it is. We don't need the additional coverage. If we want the additional coverage, we check the second box where it talks about that the policy will be amended to read that they will cover shortages in area. And of course, if that's the case, then either the buyer or the seller is going to have to pay for it. So whether or not it needs to be done is kind of up to the buyer. My experience has been that if it is a older home that has been sold a number of times, it might not be necessary to amend it, because by that point in time, we have a pretty clear idea exactly how much land is being sold and bought. If it's a new home, if it's a piece of property that's been carved out of another piece of property, then maybe it's not a bad idea to get that additional coverage just to make sure that what we think we're buying and what we think we're receiving is what we're actually receiving. The amount is not that much. The amount to cover that endorsement to that title policy is 5% of whatever the title policy premium is. So if the title policy premium is $3,000, then the amount to get this additional coverage is $150. It's not that much. If it's a rural piece of property, though, it goes up to 15% of the title policy. So if the title policy is $3,000, then it would be $450 if it's considered rural property. So that's the amount. It's not that much. And of course, it's negotiable between buyer and seller. Majority of the time I see by the contracts that cross where the buyer's paying for it. Doesn't have to be. And a lot of times it's because it's not known how much money it is. And so a lot of times it'll be, okay, let's ask the seller for that. But if I'm on the buyer side and I'm going to be asking them for some other stuff, this might be one that I might say, you know what, I'll pick this one up. Because if they don't know what that cost is, they may think that may be a pretty big cost. And now here the buyer's picking it up. So maybe we can pick up some of the other stuff. So if they don't know, then you might have an advantage there. B talks about the title commitment. The title commitment, of course, has to be delivered within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contract. And so when they receive a copy of the contract, that starts the clock ticking for them to go and deliver that title commitment. They get an extension as well. It says that if they can't get it out within 20 days, then they get an automatic extension up to 15 more days, as long as they get it out at least 3 days prior to closing. So they get a little automatic extension there if they need it. Section C talks about survey. And we have 3 options when it comes to the survey. The first one, Brittany, go ahead.
I have to change locations. Question about the survey. We had a situation where they thought that there was no survey available. We did all this, and then when it went to title and underwriting, they found one. And so it got approved via the T47 and everything. Anticipating our next listing, the seller is unsure if she's got one or can't find it, doesn't know. It's been 20 years, and she's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is there a place that we put that on this contract? We're unsure, or
No, unfortunately, it's either they're going to deliver it or they're not.
Okay.
If the seller's not sure, if they don't think they can find it, you just would not want the seller signing a contract where number one is the issue. Where number one's the choice, because number one says that if they don't deliver it, then the seller automatically has to pay for a new one. So you just wouldn't want that to happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the 1 to 4 that we would potentially get from a prospective buyer, we would make sure that it says this would be at the buyer's expense.
If that's what we're trying to do. So if
Yeah.
what I used to do is put information in the attachments of MLS. If my seller didn't, if my seller didn't have a survey to offer, we'd put that information in there somewhere. You can also put it in agent remarks, but whether or not they read it, you never know. But yeah, that's what we used to do. And I get you, because a lot of times the seller will think they know where it is. And then when it comes time to actually find it, for whatever reason, it's not there. And I have no idea where to look, but they're already locked in here, offering it. And it doesn't say that they will provide it if they can find it. It says they're going to provide it. And so if they don't provide the existing one, now they're on the hook for paying for a new one.
So it's better for us to just say, hey, we don't have it. If we know that we don't, hey, we don't have it. And then if it comes up in title, bonus.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The other part of that is that even if they have an existing survey, then the seller also has to fill out that other document called the T47, this T47 affidavit here, either that one or the declaration, one or the two, that they've got to do one of the two. And so the affidavit is a notarized document where the seller tells how the property has changed since the time of the existing survey. And the declaration does the same thing. It just doesn't have to be notarized, but there's more personal information about the seller in that document. And so a lot of times either the affidavit or the declaration can be used. But here's the issue, is that a lot of times that seller may make a mistake, or they may not put everything that really has changed about that property. And so we just really want to make sure that they fill that out accurately, because the title company and the lender both are going to depend on that document to decide. So I've had sellers who didn't want to fill that document out. I don't want to be on the hook for that. I do have an existing survey, but I don't want to fill out this document. And so in that case, we would say, okay, fine. We'll just let everybody know that there's an existing survey, but it's there for reference only, that a new one is going to have to be ordered. So that help? Yeah. So, okay.
Yes, thank you.
No problem. All right. Who's GT?
That's me, Don. It's
I
Giselle.
thought so. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. What's up?
So on the T47 and whatnot, I just want to make sure. So what I heard you say is, try not to go with checkbox number 1.
Yeah.
But
Your guy's got an existing survey and he's already provided it. The question is he willing to go ahead and fill out that other document, the T47 affidavit or declaration, saying how things have changed? Now, in your case, in your seller's case, nothing's changed. I mean, it's
Right.
exactly the same. We haven't moved any fences. We haven't built on an outdoor kitchen. We haven't added any rooms. We haven't done anything. So unless the survey would look different, and this is what we use as a litmus test. I have the existing survey here. If I went and did a new survey today, would it look the same or would it
Right.
look different?
Right.
And if it's going to look different, that's what has to be listed on the T47.
Of course.
Yeah.
And in my guy's case, just to make sure that I'm sort of tracking, also just all of the stuff, his unique situation in terms of sale and how quickly he's selling after it would make sense for him to go forward with the T47, because it's just like one less thing that the buyer has to bring to the table in terms of money.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can put a very short number of days there because you've already got it. You've already got the survey. And so you put 1 day there and you'd be fine. But
Right.
you just got to get that affidavit done. He should probably go ahead and do that now.
Gotcha.
Yeah, he should probably go ahead and do it now. And, it's going to be up to him if he wants to do the affidavit or the declaration. And again, the difference between the two, the affidavit is notarized.
And the deck is not.
The declaration is not notarized,
Yeah.
but because it's not notarized, there's a lot more personal information about him,
Sure.
his birth date and stuff like that. And so some people have started to kind of shy away from that. It's like, I don't want them to know. They're not going to be sending me a birthday present. So why should they, why do they need to know my birth date, And so you give them too much information, it makes it kind of easy to steal identity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure, anytime. So if the existing survey is provided and either the T47 affidavit or the declaration is provided, if the buyer or if the lender or the title company will not accept it, then we have to talk about who's going to pay for the new one. And that's what we see down here in this part is if it's given in a timely manner, if they give them the survey, if they give them the T47 and the lender and or the title company look at it and they're not going to accept it, who's going to pay for the new one? It's negotiable. It could be either or. And I see probably about 50-50 here. Sometimes the buyer will pay for it. Sometimes the seller will pay for it. The argument that I hear the most from the seller is that it's not my lender. I didn't pick them. And I may or may not have picked the title company. But if they're not going to accept my survey, I've given them all I can give them. I'm not going to pay for another one too. That usually that's the argument. 2 or 3. 2 is that the buyer's going to pay for a new one. 3 is the seller's going to pay for a new one. We're not going to try to use an existing survey. We're just going to say right here and now, a new one's going to have to be ordered and either the buyer or the seller is going to pay for it. And depending on who's going to pay for it is the one we're going to check. So number of days here. In number 1, if we have an existing survey, we can make that a very short amount of time, enough time for sure that we can meet the deadline. And so normally we see 3 days, maybe 5 days, maybe 7, something like that, but a relatively short period of time. In number 2 or 3, it's a balancing act because once that survey is done, somebody has to pay for it. It doesn't matter if this deal closes or not. Surveyor has done their job. They've made the survey. They're going to get paid. And so that's the first thing we need to remember is that we don't want it done too soon. It doesn't matter which side's paying for it, buyer or seller, either one. We don't want to get it done too soon because if we get it done too soon and this deal doesn't work, then somebody's going to have to pay for it. So normally we want it to be a long enough period of time where we have a pretty clear idea that the buyer is going to qualify. So 15 days, maybe something like that. And before we're sure, or pretty sure, as sure as we can be, that the buyer is going to qualify. So that's kind of the front end. The back end, like I said, it's a balancing act. The back end here is that this survey is going to be part of loan approval. So we don't want to stretch it out so long that we're sitting around waiting for the survey to get done in order to get loan approval. And so that's probably right around 30 days, 25 to 30 days. So normally this time frame that we see in either number 2 or number 3 is usually about 15 to 20, 21 days, usually somewhere in there. That way, we're pretty sure the buyer is going to qualify, yet they're going to receive it in enough time that it's not going to hold up loan approval. So somewhere in there. All right, well, I've got 6:45, so we're about halfway through the class. And I know we're not halfway through the contract, but actually we're further along than it looks because the other provisions after we get past 7 start going pretty fast. So we can take a break here if you want to take a break. If you need a break for 5 or 10 minutes, we can do that, or we can just go ahead and finish up. So, and just go on through. So if anybody has it, Brittany, go ahead. It looks like you have got your hand up.
Sorry, I did. Now those like these 10 and 21 days and things like that, that's full calendar week. There's no like Saturday.
Calendar days, yeah. Calendar days, every day counts. All of our stuff is calendar days.
It's just the earnest money delivery within
And
Right.
it's calendar days too. It's just that day 3 may make a difference.
Right,
May
where it
make a
will-
difference. Yeah. Every day is calendar day. So think of it this way, that if you're the lender or if you're the title company, then you have business days. But those of us on this side of the transaction, every day is a business day. So calendar days. And so I saw a couple of votes there. So we'll go ahead and continue on. Of course, if you guys, it's not CE. If you need to get up and stretch or whatever, please feel free to do so.
I'm just gonna make dinner while we're doing this, but I
Oh,
promise-
okay. What's for dinner?
lasagna.
Oh, there you go. All right. Just put your address in chat and we'll all show up.
Come on over.
Elba, go ahead. Go ahead. You got a
Good
question?
evening. Quick question. If they're paying cash and they don't want to purchase a survey, what do we do? What do we?
That is a very good question. And, depending on the contract that we're talking about, if you're talking about the farm and ranch contract, they have a number 4 that says no survey is required. But they don't have that in this contract. What they decided to do instead is they changed one word. They changed one word here. Let me go back, and I pulled out, went past it too quick. So here's what they did. They put in that within a certain number of days after the effective date, buyer may obtain. So now it's not a requirement. It says that if the buyer doesn't want a survey, then they can check number 2 that says that the buyer may obtain the survey at their expense. If they choose not to, then they didn't do it. And so that's how they try to cover it. But it's crazy because in the other contracts, it's actually a number 4 that says no surveys required.
So then we would put 0 days. On
You
the-
can put whatever number of days you want because they're not going to meet the requirement because they're not going to do it. You can put 5, you can put 10, you can 15. I would probably, in a case like that, and now that you bring that up, that kind of got my wheels turning here a little bit. If I were the buyer and it's a cash deal, I would probably push that maybe to 25 or something like that. And the reason why is because if I change my mind, in the very beginning, I might think, yeah, I don't really care about that or not, and put 5 days. But what happens if I get 15 days into this deal and I start thinking, maybe I do want a survey? Then it may be too late. So I'd probably put a longer period of time. That way it gives me as much time as possible to change my mind.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
So
Anytime.
that brings the question, like, if I've got 25 days on there, but my option period ends at 10, which one am I able to back out if at 25 days I don't like what this survey says, or like, how does that work?
You're ahead of the game. That's letter D.
Okay.
That would get ready to look at because it's right here. Section D says if there's something that's disclosed on the survey, if something comes up once the survey gets done, then I've got a certain number of days to complain about that. And so this is totally separate from the option period. Yeah, and that's what that part is. And I'm glad you brought it up, Brittany, because this little blank gets missed so often because it's a little blank under a big blank, and we ignore the big blank, and so we ignore the little blank too. And so really this little blank here gives us the ability to object to 3 different things. This one little time frame is for 3 different things. One of them we just talked about. If something shows up on the survey, but it also says that buyer may object in writing to defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title. If something shows up on title, something shows up on that title commitment, then we've got X number of days to object to it once we find it, once we see it. Same thing with the survey. Once we get a copy of the survey, now we have a certain number of days to object to something that might be on that. The third thing that we have the right to object to is this line here, where it talks about the possibility that my buyer may be purchasing this property for a certain reason, that they may want to do something with this property, and they've made it clear that if they can't use this property for that purpose, they don't want the property. And so that's how we protect that buyer, by putting whatever that activity is or the use is, that they would only want the property if they can do those things.
So like we had a buyer who was adamant that she was only going to buy that property if she could build a pool. So we were waiting the survey, waiting on HOA, and we put that in there. So that's where we protect her.
That's a perfect one. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I have an investor that his strategy has always been buy new homes. He buys new homes. He rents them out for 5 years. And then at the end of 5 years, he either offers them to the tenant or he owner finances them. He buys them for cash. And so that has been his strategy for as long as I have worked with him over the last 20 years. That's been his strategy. But we know that there are certain subdivisions that have in the deed restrictions that you cannot rent the property out for the first 12 months or the first 24 months. So that investor does not want to buy a property in one of those subdivisions. He doesn't want to buy a property and not be able to rent it out for 12 months or 24 months. He's buying it for rental property. He doesn't want to drive by it every day and see it empty and wish that he could have a tenant in there. So we protect him by putting the use or activity, and that's the ability to lease the property out immediately upon closing. And so if we find out in this subdivision, if we find out that it happens to be a subdivision that does not allow immediate rental, that you have to wait 12 months or 24 months, then he's out. He doesn't have to buy that property. And so that's what that big blank is for. And it's to protect your buyer if they only want the property for a certain purpose. And if they find out they can't use it for that purpose, then they don't want it. But you need that number of days, even if you don't have this certain use or activity. Even if you put single family dwelling or you put residential or whatever you put, you still need the number of days, because that number of days is what gives them the right to object to title or survey issues as well. Russ, go ahead. You're muted, buddy.
I can fix that.
You did.
So on the rental thing, is that information readily available from the HOA?
Deed restrictions. It's in the deed restrictions.
Yeah, but it's readily available?
Not always. So a lot of times what I have done for him, if we don't have copies of the deed restrictions that are readily available and the title company is going to take a while to get them, we'll just contact the management company and ask.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So if one of those things comes up, then the rest of this section talks about the seller's right to cure, what we call the cure period. So it says that once this buyer objects, the seller has 15 days to cure. And it says that the seller does, if the seller says even provided they're not obligated to incur any expense. Well, most of the time they are, but the seller gets 15 days to cure. If they don't cure it in those 15 days, now the buyer has 5 days after that to terminate and get their earnest money back. No, they don't get their option fee back, but they can get their earnest money back. But you have to go through the motions here. You can't just say, oh, there's a problem on the survey, I'm walking away. I object, I'm walking away. You've got to give the seller 15 days to cure whatever that issue is. And if they can cure it, then the deal will go on. So got to give the buyer, you've got to go through the motion. So an example of that, I had a transaction where my seller had extended the back of his garage. He extended it 3 feet on one bay of the garage, not both. And he only extended the garage. He didn't pour a floor, thank goodness. He just had his siding jutted out another 3 feet. And the reason he did that is because he had a boat and he wanted to be able to back his boat into the garage and close the door and have the whole thing enclosed in the garage. And when I went out and listed the property and I walked back there and looked at it, I said, you know, I think this this addition that you put on there, I think it encroaches on the utility easement. He said, nah, I checked it out. It doesn't. Okay, we'll see. Sure enough, when the survey came out, it did extend into the utility easement. Buyer, for whatever reason, wanted out of the property probably prior to this. And so the buyer said, okay, well, I object to that. I'm out. I'm objecting within 3 days. I'm out. No, that's not the way it works. You can object to it. Seller now has 15 days to cure, which they cured almost overnight. They went and tore that back out. They had a contractor come in and put the back on the way that it was. All done. So buyer was still locked into the purchase. Not happy about it, but they were still locked into the purchase. You got to go through you got to go through the process. If you don't, then you're in breach of contract. Section E. Section E talks about title notices. Oop, hang on just a second. I heard a hand go up. I'm just out of the screen. Hang on just a second. I'll be back. Okay, Russ, go ahead.
Well, I heard the last part pretty well, but the first part where the double I's are,
Mm-hmm.
is that 3 days? What is the time on that one?
Let me go back to it.
That one right there.
It's whatever number of days you put in there. I mean, usually it's not a whole lot. Most of the time I see like 3 to 5 because that's the time to object. And so it really becomes important that when the title policy comes out or the commitment comes out, that they go and look at it. When the survey comes out, it gets looked at because there usually is a pretty short period of time. It's not very, very long normally.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, title notices. So title notices, there are 12 of them, and every single one of these creates some sort of responsibility on the seller to disclose something to the buyer. And the only exception to that is the very first one, where it talks about a responsibility that we have, which is advising the buyer to have an abstract of title covering the property examined by an attorney of the buyer's selection, or the buyer should be furnished with or obtain a title policy. So this is a throwback all the way back to the original License Act, 1939, where it talked about the fact that as an agent or broker, we should advise a buyer that they should never purchase a property without having the title checked. Now, as long as you're using a promulgated form, it's there. The advice is there in writing, which is the requirement. So as long as you're using a promulgated form, you're fine. When you're representing a buyer in a builder transaction and you're using the builder contract, that verbiage is not in the builder contract. Builder doesn't care if we've done what we're supposed to do or not. And so it's not there. And so it does show up in other places. The 1506 will solve that issue for you. That's one of the reasons why we require it, is because the 1506 does have that language in there. So it really doesn't matter what type of property the buyer's purchasing, that notice is in there. Because otherwise, if they were buying a new home and you were using the new home contract, you would have to advise them by use of another addendum called notice to prospective buyer. So that's one of the reasons why we do the 1506. Just so you know. Second one talks about HOA, property owner association, whether or not the property is actually located in a subdivision where there is mandatory membership in the association, which is the vast majority of them. And then, of course, it also just goes into information regarding the fact that the HOA most likely is going to have a fee, and you're going to have to pay that fee. It's a mandatory fee. You're going to have to pay it. If you don't pay it, then, of course, the HOA has the ability to come and foreclose on you and all of that good stuff. It does refer to the addendum, the HOA addendum, which is really called the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership in a property owner association. We just call it the HOA addendum, where they will talk about if their documents are going to be requested, who's going to pay for them, who's going to pay for the transfer of the account, and all of that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one question I have, and again, this is on the seller side for this one. We kind of have a seller who just is kind of all over the place, doesn't have her stuff together, unsure of the survey. She sent us a link for the HOA information, but it doesn't give us like contact information. When we are like promising to provide all these things, is it better to put it, I guess what I'm asking, is it better to like put it on the buyer? Like buyer will pay to furnish this? Or, I mean, I know that's all up for negotiation, but like, what's the standard?
Yeah, so it is in the HOA addendum. You know, number one is the seller provides it at seller's expense. Number two is the seller provides it at buyer's expense. So either one, if they're going to do it, if you're sure, if the seller is pretty sure that they would not live up to that requirement, then I would put it on the buyer, because you don't want, the last thing you want is your seller to be in breach of contract.
So like, how can we help her find that stuff? Like,
Excuse me.
you know, I hate to put it on there and then be like,
Yeah, so the HOA is going to be through the management company unless they self-manage, and very few subdivisions self-manage anymore. They all have management companies that will do it. And a lot of times the question is, even if the deed restrictions are available online or any of that, that's really not what they're describing when they talk about subdivision documents. And that's what the HOA addendum says, talks about subdivision documents, and deed restrictions are only a small part of that. There's also what they call a resale certificate. And besides a resale certificate, there are a lot of attachments that give budget information for the subdivision, gives all sorts of information. And so most of the time, my experience has been that part of the contract is hardly ever really met, because they'll give them deed restrictions and think that they have fulfilled the requirement, and they haven't. And so that's a lot of the reason why I like to say, let's just pass that on to the buyer. That way, if it's the buyer's responsibility to get it for themselves and they don't get the right stuff, then that's on them, rather than, you know, my job is to try to protect my seller if I'm representing the seller. And so I would rather the buyer provide that for themselves. Okay. Section 3, statutory tax districts. This is water district, mud districts in particular, probably in this area more than anything else. We're kind of in a unique position here in the Houston area, where water districts are through MUDs, typically municipal utility districts. Try explaining that to somebody who's just moving into town, that they get their fresh water through something called a MUD. But if you get outside of the Houston area, water districts are very uncommon. I mean, they're very common here, but they're very uncommon in other parts of the state. Harris County has 550 MUD districts in just Harris County. And of course, every one of them is its own taxing authority. They set their own tax rates. And so that's what this is talking about. The statutory tax districts is telling a buyer, seller, delivering that information to the buyer. The delivery of this information has changed over the last 2 or 3 years. Prior to the last 2 or 3 years, we used to fill the information out. Houston Association of Realtors, and this was an HAR form, not a TAR form, again, because water districts are really pretty much in just the Houston area. So Houston Association of Realtors, HAR, had a form, HAR 400, where we used to fill out the information as to what the last known tax rate was, whether or not the property was in an extraterritorial jurisdiction of some municipality, what the bonds were, all of that information. They changed the rule about 2 or 3 years ago that now says that is not on the agent's plate. It is not the agent's responsibility to get that information anymore. It is the seller's responsibility to deliver, like it says here. It is the seller's responsibility to deliver that information to the buyer and the buyer to sign it. So the way the seller is supposed to get it is to contact their water district, contact their mud district, and get this information. And mud districts have now been required to provide this information. Just because the law says they're required to provide it doesn't mean they all are. And so once in a while, you'll run into a situation where the water district does not have the information. They're not going to provide it. And so we do kind of have to get in the middle of it. Texas Association of Realtors has created a new form that we use as a last resort. And that's what it says. It says this information should be coming from the water district. Only use this form as a last resort if you cannot get the information from the water district. We don't want the seller to be in non-compliance. And so here it is, agent. It's back on your plate again. So, but we're not the first point of contact on this now. We're the last. Section 4, Tidewaters. This talks about the fact that some property in the state of Texas sits on land that adjoins a body of water that is affected by tides. And so, of course, this is a state form. And so there are actually 2 documents that could apply here. One is called Addendum for Property on the Seaward Side of the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. So if you're familiar with the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway or not, it is a man-made canal that runs the entire length of the coastline of Texas, actually all the way around the Gulf Coast, up the east coast of Florida, and all the way up the eastern seaboard. So the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, called something else, the Eastern Waterway on the East Coast, is this man-made canal where they use for moving cargo, tugboats, barges, things like that. And it runs anywhere from a few hundred feet inland to about 1.5 miles inland. So we're talking about property that is on the seaward side of that. Property that's on the seaward side of the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. So it does not include inland property. So the addendum talks about the fact, and actually it's a warning. It's an addendum that says, if you own property in this swath of land, then it's possible that your property could end up on a public beach. That, I guess, through subsidence or storm events or whatever, that your property could end up on a public beach. It may not be on a beach right now, but through subsidence or storm events or erosion or whatever, it could end up on a beach. And if it ends up on the beach, of course, belongs to the state of Texas. Your structure cannot be on their beach. And so the warning is that if through subsidence or storm events or erosion or whatever, your property, your structure ends up on the beach, you have to tear it down or move it. You have to move it or tear it down. That's the warning. The other addendum they're talking about here talks about that if your property adjoins a body of water that is affected by tides, so that could be the Gulf, could be the Bay system, certain rivers, bayous, creeks that run into either the Bay system or the Gulf because they're affected by tides too. All it says is that if you own to the edge of the water, if you own to the water's edge, then you can't really judge how much land you have by the edge of the water. Because since that water level is affected by tides, sometimes the level is going to be up here and you just have a little bit of land showing. Sometimes the tide will be low and it'll be a lot of land showing. and says, so you can't really judge how much land you own by the edge of the water. The only way to truly determine the amount of land you own is through a survey. That's all that document says. 5 talks about annexation. If the property is outside a city limits, someday it may be inside a city limits. And that's really about all it says. It just warns a buyer that you may not live in a city right now. You may not be subject to city taxes right now, but at some point, if they come and annex you, you will be. So it's a warning too. 6, property located in a certificated service area of a utility service provider. This has to do with a utility district. If a property is currently without utilities, specifically water, then if you're going to buy this property, before you close, you should determine how long is it going to take to get water if it's coming from a water district, that how long is it going to take for that district to get water to you, and how much is it going to cost. That you, as a buyer, you should determine those things before you close. Again, all of these are disclosures that the seller's having to make to the buyer, other than that first one, which is a disclosure we have to make to the buyer. 7, public improvement districts, what we call a PID. If the property is located inside of a public improvement district, and that means those properties are subject to a fee that has to be paid for a certain amount of time. And it's usually because either a city or a county or somebody has come and done some kind of capital improvement, and they're charging the homeowners for that capital improvement. Curbs, gutters, sidewalks, whatever. Before the city or the county would do those capital improvements, there had to be a vote of the homeowners who are affected by that, and they had to agree to pay whatever that fee is going to be. Well, that fee is usually based on a 5-year or 7-year payout. And so if this property is sold during those 5 years or 7 years that the payout has not been paid off completely, then the buyer is going to be assuming the remainder of that cost. And that's what that talks about, that if this property is part of a public improvement district, seller has to disclose to the buyer how much money is left, how much money has to be paid per year. 8 is transfer fee, and transfer fee is private transfer fee. And Giselle, I think if she's still on, I can't tell if she is or not. I can't see everybody, ran into this in Bridgeland the other day.
Yeah,
Where, oh, you are here. Okay. So our seller, the seller of this property, is subject to, they call it a lot of different things. I think in his case, they called it an enhancement fee or something like that. It is a fee that is paid every single time the property is sold. It's a fee that's paid by the seller on behalf of the sale of the property. And it kind of goes into a slush fund. It goes into this fund for the capital improvements for the subdivision. And not every subdivision has it, but some of the later ones, Town Lake has it, Bridgeland has it. There's several that have this fee that's going to have to be paid, and it's paid by the seller. I think if I remember right, I think Bridgeland's is 0.5% of the sales price. So we're talking about a significant amount of money. Sales price of $400,000, we're talking about $2,000 in this case. But it has to be paid, and it's going to be paid, and it's not really an issue for the buyer now because the seller pays it. But the disclosure has to do with the fact that someday that buyer may be a seller, and then they're going to have to pay it too. 9, propane gas system service area. This really applies mostly in the Hill Country, although there are a couple of subdivisions in Montgomery County, and I think maybe 1 or 2 in Galveston County as well, where the subdivision receives propane gas the way that we receive natural gas. You know, you get out into the country, most of the time, if they have propane, it's this massive tank that's in the backyard. But sometimes some of the subdivisions don't do that anymore. They feel like that it's just too dangerous to have that big old tank out there. It's like a bomb. And so they feel like that instead that it's piped from a central distribution point to each residence. And so if this is a subdivision that has that, then the buyer is being notified by the seller, and most likely they will have a monthly charge as opposed to a single charge every time they fill up that tank. Section 10, notice of water level fluctuations, just tells them that if you adjoin a lake, then the level of that lake is going to rise and fall for various reasons. And again, you can't judge how much land you own by the edge of the water. That's all that one says. 11, certificate of mold remediation. If the property has been remediated for mold within the last 5 years, seller has to disclose that to the buyer and provide them with a certificate of mold remediation. If it has been more than 5 years since the house has been remediated for mold, seller no longer has the responsibility to disclose that to the buyer. And 12, required notices. This is for letting the buyer know that the property is in a water district or a utility district or one of those PIDs. This is the notification. This is the disclosure that they are affected by one of those situations, one of those scenarios. On to section 7, property condition. This is the section that's going to talk about the rights of the buyer to do inspections. It's going to talk about the rights of the seller in terms of getting repairs done and things like that. A talks about access, inspections, and utilities. Says that the buyer's agents have the right to access the property at reasonable times. Reasonable time is any time the buyer and seller can agree. Buyer can have the property inspected by inspectors that are selected by the buyer and licensed by TREC or otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. So when we think about when inspections are going to be done, which is typically during the option period, we have a very short period of time normally to get those inspections done. Maybe 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, something like that. So even though the rules allow 2 possibilities for inspectors, most likely it's going to need to be that TREC licensed inspector. The TREC licensed inspector is one individual who has the ability to check everything versus otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. That means an electrician could do an electrical inspection, plumber could do a plumbing inspection, roofer could do a roofing inspection, HVAC could do heating and air conditioning, a foundation engineer could do foundation. Logistically, trying to get each one of those tradespeople out there in this very short period of time, probably not going to happen. So almost 100% of the time, it's going to end up being a TREC licensed inspector. But the reason they identify it that way is because they don't want somebody's brother-in-law coming out and do a so-called inspection on the property and call a whole bunch of stuff that just doesn't even make any sense. It has to be somebody who is actually licensed by TREC. They don't want somebody bringing their brother-in-law out who built a house in 1976, so they think they know everything about home construction, and they start calling all kinds of crazy stuff. If the information given does not come from one of these 2 sources, it is not even things that have to be disclosed because it wasn't done by a qualified inspector. So this is also the provision that says that the seller will keep utilities on throughout the entire transaction. Sellers don't always care for that, but it does say that they will keep them on during the entire transaction, not just long enough to do inspections, all the way through. B talks about whether or not we're going to be using a seller disclosure. In most situations, we are. So it would either be checking number 1 or number 2. Number 1 is where the seller disclosure has already been filled out and the buyer had received a copy of it prior to making the offer. That's the best way. That way we know that the buyer has had an opportunity to review that. They made their offer based on the things that they know at this point. Number two also allows a buyer to go ahead and make an offer and negotiate a contract without having received the seller disclosure yet. But then that also creates a scenario where once the buyer does receive it, they have 7 days to review it. And if they don't like what it says, they can walk away. So it's another way out for the buyer that if we don't have to have that situation, let's not. Let's go ahead and get those seller disclosures filled out ahead of time. That way the buyer is at least a little more locked in than they would be otherwise. The third option, seller not required to furnish the notice under the Texas Property Code. The need for a seller disclosure is not a TREC requirement. It's not a real estate law requirement. It is a Texas Property Code requirement. And the Texas Property Code does list 11 exceptions to filling out a seller disclosure. There are certain sellers who are not required to fill out a seller disclosure. Foreclosure, for example, if somebody is foreclosing on a property, then the person who's losing that house does not have to fill out a seller disclosure. In a divorce scenario where one spouse is buying out the other spouse, no seller disclosure is required. In a trust or in a state, they don't have to fill out a seller disclosure. So there are 11 exceptions to who has to fill one out. What we do have to remember is that Texas is a disclosure state, which means that even if they don't have to fill out the seller disclosure, that does not relieve them of disclosing what they know. If they know of defects in the property, they are still required to disclose those defects. Whether they fill out the document or not, that's irrelevant. This only has to do with, do they have to fill out the document or not? Every seller has to disclose the defects that they know about their property. And the seller disclosure is not a guarantee. It is not saying, as the seller, I guarantee this is the condition of my property. It is the seller saying, to the best of my knowledge, this is the condition of my property. And so gives the seller the ability to say that they are not aware in a lot. And that's the way most of these questions are worded, is, as the seller, are you aware of the following situation? And it's a yes or a no. It's yes, I'm aware of it, or no, I'm not aware of it. No, I'm not aware of it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that I don't have knowledge of it. I don't know that it's there. So, C, of course, talks about lead-based paint. Yeah, Elba, go ahead.
I came across a few listings that had unknown and they didn't disclose nothing at all. And I always try to upload every document so the buyers can see, or the sellers. But I mean, some of them don't upload nothing, or just put unknown or can't disclose. What do we do in that scenario?
Well, if it's true, then it's okay. I mean, I know a lot of times investors feel like that they shouldn't have to fill out a seller disclosure. That is not true. They are not one of the 11 exceptions. And so I know a lot of times, because they're aggravated at that they just go through and they mark not aware, not aware, not aware, not aware, not aware. And, you know, they better be telling the truth, because if something comes up later on and it's discovered that they actually did know, then they're in trouble.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's supposed to be them telling the truth. And if they're telling the truth, and I could see where there very well could be some scenarios where seller is not aware of anything. Maybe that could be. As long as it's true, then okay. But if it's not true, then that's going to be an issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. Sure. C, seller disclosure, lead-based paint. Property built prior to 1978, seller has to disclose about their knowledge of lead-based paint. If they don't know, they don't know. It doesn't require that they do anything. Even if they disclose that, yes, there is lead-based paint in this house. I know there is. I've had it tested. I know there's lead-based paint here. That's all that's required. The federal document only talks about disclosure, does not talk about remediation, does not talk about the fact that they have to try to eradicate it, which they're not going to be able to because it's on the wall. And so all they have to do is disclose if it's there or not, as to the best of their knowledge. D, acceptance of property condition. Of course, this has to do with accepting the property as is. So as is, of course, means it's the present condition of the property with any and all defects without warranty, except for the warranties of title and warranties in this contract. So it's saying, based on what I know right now, I'm willing to accept the property as is. But if you go a little bit further, it says buyer's agreement to accept the property as is under this paragraph does not preclude the buyer from inspecting the property or from negotiating repairs or treatments or from terminating the contract during the option period if they've got one. So just because they're saying, yes, I'm accepting the property as is, they're not giving up any of their rights. They're not giving up the right to inspect. They're not giving up the right to negotiate. They are just stating that at this time, if they mark box 1, then they are stating that they're willing to accept the property based on what they know now. They're willing to accept it as is. But if they have some things that they want to have done, then they would check this box, they'd check that box, and then of course they'd fill in the information. This space is only for, like it says, specific repairs and treatments, things they absolutely know they want done. Fix the broken window, replace the broken window in the kitchen. That's specific. You cannot use general terminology like subject to inspections, to be determined, whatever, to be decided at another point. None of that. It only is there for very specific things that they already know that they want to get done. E talks about lender required repairs. Lender required repairs are going to come from one of two places: appraisal or amendments. If we do an amendment saying that there are going to be certain repairs that are going to be done prior to closing, that amendment is supposed to be sent to the lender. If the appraiser sees some things they want done, then of course the appraisal is going to be sent to the lender. When the lender sees these things that need to be done, they are going to become lender required repairs. Lender's going to say, now that they've been brought to our attention, they're going to have to be done. And they're going to have to be done prior to closing. And then of course, after they're done, probably going to have to be checked. Somebody's probably going to have to go out and approve those lender required repairs that were done. There's an additional protection for the buyer, and it's in that last sentence. Says that if the lender required repairs exceed 5% of the sales price, buyer may go ahead and terminate the contract and the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. So even if the seller says, that's okay, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. If the cost is going to exceed 5% of the sales price, buyer can say, that's just too much. That's more than we thought was going to need to be done. So we have decided to walk away. And of course, they'll get their earnest money back, not their option fee, but they'll get their earnest money back. So a lot of different ways for the buyer to get out of this deal. But other than the option period, something else has to happen first before the buyer gets the right to walk away. F talks about completion of repairs and treatments. In this, it talks about who has the ability to do the repairs. Unless it's agreed to in writing beforehand, the seller cannot do their own repairs. It says that the repairs must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide those repairs, or if no license is required by law, has to be done by somebody who is commercially engaged in the trade of providing those repairs or treatments. So that means somebody has to be either licensed to do it or they make their living doing it, one or the two. Otherwise, they're not supposed to be doing those repairs. Environmental matters, most of the time you're not going to run into this issue. when we talk about environmental matters, we're really talking about one of three things: toxic substances, wetlands, or endangered species. And so this says that if any of those things exist, or if the buyer's concerned about any of those things, they can have the property inspected to check and see if any of those things exist. And another addendum has to be attached to the contract in order to give the buyer the ability to check for those things. In regular residential real estate, it's probably just not going to happen. Every once in a while, I see the addendum actually attached to the contract, but I've never seen the buyer go ahead and get those things checked. They had the right because they created that right with the addendum. They just never did it. H, residential service contracts. We know those as home warranties. In this section, it gives the buyer the right to purchase a home warranty if they would like to. They tell them that it is optional, it's not required. But it also creates a provision where the seller might reimburse the buyer for a portion or for all of that home warranty. So sometimes we see these provisions in the contract that are created because the real estate commission got sick and tired of real estate agents putting stuff in special provisions that they felt like shouldn't be there. And this is one of them. It was very common before this provision was created. It was very common for special provisions to have a provision that said seller to provide home warranty at an amount not to exceed $650, something like that. Well, when you state it that way, that means the seller to provide. That means who gets to pick? The seller. Who's the seller going to pick? The cheapest one they can find. And so, of course, what ended up happening a lot of times is that that's what happened. They would pick the cheapest one they could find. The buyer would move in. Something would happen somewhere along the way. They would try to turn it into the home warranty company, and the home warranty company would come back and it'd say, "Oh, we don't cover that. That was not part of the service that you were given. It's not part of the policy that you received. Could have been, but that was an add-on. And so I'm sorry, that refrigerator is not covered. That's an add-on, and the seller didn't provide that." And so a buyer would go back to the seller and say, "You did this. This is your fault. You should pay for it." So the real estate commission got tired of that. And the real estate commission said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give the buyer the ability to purchase it, which means, of course, the buyer gets to pick it. And at closing, the seller might reimburse the buyer up to a certain amount, maybe for some of it, maybe for all of it, whatever the amount they agree to. Could be zero. But they created that provision specifically because of the way that it was worded before. It created more problems than it solved. And so they created this provision. All right, Section 8. They're a lot shorter and they go a lot faster. Section 8. Brokers and sales agents. This is one where if you fall into a certain category, you have to make a disclosure. And the first one they talk about is if you are a party to the transaction. If you are the buyer, if you are the seller, you have to disclose the fact that you have a real estate license. And the reason for that is this disclosure is that they feel like that it's an unfair advantage. It's like a warning. You're warning the other side, hey, I've got a real estate license, therefore I know more about this than you do. Might not be true, but that's the warning. I'm telling them that as a licensed individual, I deal with this all the time. And so I may have an unfair advantage against you. And so that's what the disclosure is. Also says that if you are representing certain relatives, your spouse, your parent, or your child, then you also have to disclose that relationship. If your client is your spouse, your parent, or your child, then you have to disclose that relationship. They used to just say relative. Now they actually spell out what relatives they are. So, of course, spouse, parent, or child, exes don't count, in-laws don't count, stepchildren don't count. Now, if they've been adopted, then yes, now they're your child. So if they fall into the category, they fall into the category. If they don't, they don't. Siblings don't matter. So either they count or they don't. Or if your client is a business entity in which the broker, you, own more than 10% of it. If it's an LLC, if it's a corporation, if you own more than 10%, you have to disclose that you are more than 10% owner. You don't have to say, I am 17.5% owner of this. You just have to say that I am more than 10% owner of this entity. Or if your client is a trust for which broker or sales agent acts as a trustee, if you are the trustee for a trust, or of which the broker, sales agent, or broker or sales agent spouse, parent, or child is a beneficiary, then you have to disclose that as well. So Brittany, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So we have, we've represented family and it was a sibling, and we have been putting things like seller related to agent. You're saying that that's not necessary unless it was our parent, spouse, or child?
It's not, but it's not going to hurt anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just kind of transparency, but it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's more than you need it to, but it makes no difference. I have never seen any of these make any difference in terms of the transaction or whether or not it's acceptable or not acceptable. Anyway, I've never had on any property I've ever bought or I've ever sold disclosing the fact that I have a real estate license. I've never had the party on the other side of the transaction come and say, oh, well, never mind. I don't want to deal with you then, you know? So it's just a disclosure issue. 9 has to do with closing. We do have identified a closing date here, and it says it will be on or before that date. Well, of course, on or before that date, the only date that's actually been agreed to is the date that you see here. And so if it's going to be before, the only way it can be before is if both parties agree. One party can't arbitrarily say, well, hey, we're ready 3 days early, and so we're moving the closing. Both sides have to agree to it. It is this date that has been agreed to. It can happen on or before, but both sides have to agree to it. And then, of course, the remainder of this talks about what's going to take place at closing. Well, the biggest thing is that the property, where before we had this promise for a promise to create the contract, now the contract is being fulfilled. So we talked about the fact that the contract is actually fully executed at closing, because this is a contract to buy a house and sell a house. Well, that doesn't happen until closing. So this transaction, this contract is fully executed at closing because the seller is going to execute and deliver a general warranty deed. What does a deed do? The deed is a document that conveys ownership, in this case, from the seller to the buyer. So the seller is going to execute the deed that will convey ownership to the buyer. In return, the buyer is going to pay the sales price that we saw in section 3 in what they call good funds acceptable to the escrow agent. Good funds, typically either cashier's check or wire transfer, one of the two. One of those two are going to have to be. Sorry, I thought I heard a question pop up. Okay. Third one, seller buyer will execute and deliver all the notices, statements, certificates, affidavits, in essence, all the paperwork that's necessary to complete the transaction. And of course, we know the buyer typically has a lot more to sign than the seller. Buyer is actually going through 2 closings. They're closing the home and the loan. So they've got a lot more, usually. 4, no liens, assessments, or security interests against property which will not be satisfied out of the sales proceeds unless we're assuming a loan. Then, of course, we know that there's still going to be something left over. Private transfer fee that we talked about back in section 6 will be the obligation of the seller. Seller is going to have to pay those private transfer fees. 10 has to do with when possession is going to take place, typically at closing or funding. And if it's not going to be at closing and funding, then it's most likely going to be according to a temporary lease. If the buyer's moving in prior to closing, which is not a good idea, then we use the buyer's temporary residential lease. If the seller is staying after closing, then we use the seller temporary residential lease. One of the two. They are promulgated forms. Make sure you use them if your buyer's moving in early or your seller's staying late. Do not put it in special provisions. Putting it in special provisions would be the unauthorized practice of law. So you don't want to do that. They have a new provision about smart devices that talks about making sure that anything that the seller has, any kind of app or any kind of program that the seller has that can control anything about the house, must be deleted at the time of closing or prior to. They don't want the seller, you don't want to have a bad transaction between buyer and seller. And so the seller decide to get back at the buyer and keep turning their lights off and on throughout, have raising the heat up to 90 degrees or any of that. They have to delete all the stuff that they have that will have any control over the property itself. 11, special provisions. Only things that can go in here. And they tell us it's intended only for additional informational items. Has to be something that does not change the terms of the contract. So an informational item is a statement that completes a blank in a contract form. So we can use this for overflow. If whatever it is we have to put in one of these blanks doesn't fit, then we can move it down here. We can put it in here. Disclose factual information or provides instructions. And it doesn't, anything that changes the terms of the contract, it does not go here. If it goes here, it means it either had to be created by an attorney or by the parties themselves. You and I cannot create a provision that would have any effect on the terms of the contract. That would be practicing law. One of the major issues that the Real Estate Commission has, where the Real Estate Commission really wants to make sure that we do not go further than our license allows us to go. Our license is really pretty limiting. I mean, in terms of the things that you can do with it. And a lot of times our clients don't know that. Our clients think because we're the face of this transaction for them, they think that we're capable of doing everything. Whatever it is they need, we're capable of doing it. We have to know our limitations because they don't. And you don't want to stumble into something that's going to get you in trouble. And a lot of times, I've always said that when it comes down to answering a question or doing something, that before I answer that question or before I do that thing, I ask myself, am I the best person to answer this, or am I the best person to do this? And if the answer is no, then I'm probably not going to do it. I'm not going to be the one to do it. Maribel, go ahead. You're muted.
I have a contract for a land, and my buyer told me that I need to put there the engineer and architect information. So is there?
I think that's okay because that's information, that's factual information. So it had to do with uses of the property, things that they use the property for, or what kind of information was it?
It's a land. He tried to build the family, the single family.
Okay.
It's like an inspection, send the engineer and the architect to check the land and everything for make a build.
Okay, I don't see a problem with that. I think that's factual information.
These kind of things go over there.
I'm sorry, say it again.
These kind of things are over there.
I think as long as it doesn't change the terms of the contract, it's something that can go there. If it doesn't fit there, if there's more information than fits there, then you would have to attach it as an exhibit or an addendum. You would just say, for additional information, see exhibit 1 or whatever, and then have that information there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say is that I would not, if you have information that came directly from like an engineer or an inspector or something like that, I wouldn't paraphrase it. I would take that information and include it so they can see exactly how it was written by that engineer or exactly how that was written by the inspector or whoever it was. I wouldn't try to paraphrase it. I would want to just include it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Section 12, settlement and other expenses. This has created so many issues for us, and because of the wording of it. And I actually, when this contract came out, this is going to tell you how much people, the real estate commission, listens sometimes. When this came out, a lot of us saw the issue that we run into all the time, and we complained about it and said, you really need to take a look at this because it's not going to make sense to a lot of people. So we start up here in this little part right here where it says seller shall pay the following expenses. These are known as seller expenses. And so, of course, it goes all the way down to number 2, where the buyer shall pay for the following expenses. So everything here in number 1, 12A, 1A, B, and C are seller expenses. These are things the seller going to pay. Well, here is where it gets messed up. In B, the following amount to be applied to brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. Now, when agents look at it, this is all they see. These are charges that the buyer has agreed to pay. And so they look at it and they think, no, my buyer is not going to pay it. My buyer doesn't want to pay my commission. We want the seller to pay it. And so, but if I put it here, it says that the buyer has agreed to pay this number here. Here's what they're getting at. When you get your buyer representation agreement signed, when you get that buyer rep signed, you put in the amount that you're going to be paid. At that point, it becomes a buyer expense. The buyer at that point agrees that you are going to get paid that amount. At that point, it's a buyer's expense. Here, when we move it into the section 12 of the contract, we're trying to shift that burden away from what the buyer has agreed to do in the buyer rep and move it over here as a seller expense. When they say that these are fees that the buyer has agreed to pay, then they're saying, because agent, you did what you were supposed to do and you got your buyer rep signed before you did any of this, the buyer right now is on the hook for that. Here is your opportunity to shift that over to a seller expense. And so whatever number you put in there is shifting that over to the seller expense. But people are not looking up here. They're looking here. And when they look here, they go, oh, this says the buyer's going to pay it. No, the buyer's already said they're going to pay it. This is us trying to move it to be a seller's charge. So 12A1B, we use this when we are trying to negotiate directly with the seller to pay our commission. And I think after June, this is the only way it's going to happen. I think this compensation agreement between brokers thing is going to go away. This TXR 2402, I think that's going to be a thing of the past. I think that we will always have to be negotiating directly with the seller for our commission if we're representing the buyer. I think that's coming. That's what I see. Yeah, Brittany, go ahead.
We actually just closed a deal on the buyer side with eXp Realty, and they're already doing
that. You're right.
They did not accept the broker's compensation agreement. They're like, don't even submit it. And it was a learning curve for us because we didn't know anything other than we use this broker's compensation agreement. And they were like, no. And then it was a little confusing for our buyer to explain to her, like when we went back and we were looking at seller concessions, where we adjusted that. And so it took some extra explaining that this is where they're seeing our compensation. That's why it's now on their agreement in this, in the contract. and how it affected them, because it being right there,
Yep.
you know, kind of back to back, they were like, oh, wait a minute. So I'm paying what now? And so that's EXP's already shifted to that. So that was kind of,
You're right. You're right. Yeah. We hate to give the competition any kind of props, but you know, they probably had the right idea, because it's where we're all going to end up, I think. And to me, it makes sense.
it threw us for a loop, because
It would.
legally, and what we knew to be true, we were like, so is this right? Because as far as we knew, we needed the broker's compensation agreement in addition to that. But
Yep. EXP is already doing it. I think Redfin is already doing it. There are several companies that have already switched to it, and I think it's where we're all going to end up. So 12A, 1B. Yeah, Elba, go ahead.
Okay, so how do you guys want it? Because I just had a sale, and I did the 3% on B, and he came back and told me, no, you need to check page 10, the 3%, and send me the broker to broker.
Yeah.
So I went ahead and did it just to get it over with. But how do you guys want it? I mean,
we're right now at this point, we'll allow you to do it either way. It depends on how the listing agreement's been filled out. If the listing agreement is filled out where we have section 5A filled out, where we said we're going to charge 5% total and we're going to share 2.5% with the buyer's agent, then we would use page 10 and the TXR 2402 compensation agreement between brokers. But if our listing agreement has 5B filled in, where it says that the seller is only agreed to pay our commission and nothing to the buyer, then it's going to have to show up in section 12. It depends on how the listing agent has filled out the listing agreement.
okay, but it's either or. It can't be both.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yes, absolutely. If you look at the listing agreement, it is either or. You either fill out 5A or 5B. I cannot tell you how many times that through compliance, I have typed that the listing agreement is filled out incorrectly. You have listed both 5A and 5B. It can't be both. Either they're paying enough for both sides, or they're only paying enough for one side. It cannot be both of those. It is one or the other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. Yep. All right. So 12A1B is where we're negotiating directly with the seller, asking the seller to pay our commission if we're representing the buyer. 12A1C are concessions to the buyer, not including commission. Other buyer's expenses, closing costs, prepaids, whatever the lender will allow the seller to pay. You could have something in B and something in C. They are completely unrelated. B pays an agent, C pays something on behalf of the buyer. And then 12, number 2 there goes into expenses for the buyer. 13, prorations, taxes for the current year, interest, rents, HOA, certain charges, namely property taxes, HOA dues, are going to be prorated. They accrue daily, but they are charged once a year. And so as of the day of closing, seller will pay their part of the property taxes for that year. Buyer will be responsible for all the taxes at the end of the year. HOA, typically seller has already paid for the entire year. So from the day of closing until the end of the year, the buyer has to reimburse the seller for the remainder of that time. 14, casualty loss. Casualty loss says that if anything happens to the property during the time after it goes under contract, seller is responsible to put the property back in the condition that it was in. And if for some reason they can't, most likely the transaction will terminate, and the buyer, of course, will get their earnest money back. 15, default, talks about if somebody is in breach of contract, that the other side has remedies. The other side has certain rights. If the buyer's in default, the seller can take the earnest money, or they could sue for all damages, or they could try to sue for specific performance, which is trying to force the buyer to go ahead and buy the property. If the seller's in default, buyer can either sue for damages, or they can try to sue and make the seller go ahead and sell the property. So the buyer doesn't get as many rights as the seller in breach of contract. 16, mediation. One of the alternative dispute resolutions, the state of Texas encourages mediation in the event buyer and seller have a disagreement. Then they would rather they mediate it rather than anything else. Mediation, of course, is non-binding unless the parties agree to it. But that is what they suggest, at least as an initial step. It may go to something later on. It could go to litigation later on or something like that. But mediation is what they prefer because it's usually probably just a step above informal discussion. 17, attorney's fees. Buyer, seller, listing broker, other broker who prevails in a legal proceeding is entitled to recover reasonable attorney's fees and all costs of such proceeding. So if it does go to litigation, if the side that prevails may be able to collect at least a portion of what they paid in order to protect themselves or whatever. 18, escrow. Title company's job is also to close the transaction. They talk about the escrow agent, not a party to the transaction. Title company is supposed to be a neutral service provider. They don't represent either side. They're supposed to be neutral. A lot of times they are not all that neutral, usually because the agents are the ones who pick the title company, even though it's supposed to be between buyer and seller. Most of the time, buyer and sellers pretty much rely on the agent to tell them who to use. And so who's the agent going to pick? Probably somebody they've got some sort of relationship with. Maybe they give them a lot of business or whatever. So even though the title company is supposed to be a neutral service provider, a lot of times they do show favoritism one way or the other, even though they're not supposed to. B talks about expenses. How the earnest money is going to be applied. First, it'll go towards down payment. And then if there's any money still left over, it'll go towards closing costs and the rest of the charges. Then at the end of that, if there's still money left over, it's going to go back to the buyer. C talks about demand. In the event that this does not close, earnest money is being held by the title company. It does give the title company a way to release that money, even if there's not an agreement between buyer and seller. Most title companies will not take that route. They're going to say, we want something in writing where both sides agree where the money goes. Otherwise, we're just going to sit on it. 7 years from now or so, we'll send it to the state of Texas as unclaimed assets, and we'll let y'all fight over it then. 19, representations. All covenants, representations, warranties in the contract survive closing. So whatever is said prior to closing, those promises still have meaning even afterwards. This provision also allows the seller to show the property for backup offers if they want to. 20, federal requirements. If the seller is considered a foreign person, then according to the contract, the buyer withholds a certain amount of money from the sales proceeds. The reality is the title company will do that. Title company will withhold a certain amount from their proceeds, give them the opportunity to provide documentation that says that they should receive that money back. If they don't get that documentation, then they will send it on to the IRS. 21 is notices. Contact information for buyers and sellers need to be placed in this part of the contract. A lot of people are going to get a copy of this contract. So contact information for buyers and sellers really needs to be there. A lot of times agents will just put their own information. Don't do that. Put contact information for your party. If you want to just put email and not a phone number, I get it. But you need to have some kind of contact information there, because if something comes to you rather than going to them, and it was supposed to be delivered in a timely manner, Now it falls on you to get it where it needs to go. Let it go wherever it needs to go without you. You can get a copy of it too, but let it go where it needs to go. Whoops, 22, agreement of the parties. These are addenda that are going to be attached to the contract. And of course, there are other ones that could be there too. 23, consult an attorney before signing. If a client feels like that they need the advice of an attorney, we should never discourage that. If they feel like they need it, then they should receive it. They should go ahead and get it. The advice, though, that we would want to give is that they should do that. They should seek their advice before they sign. Once they've signed, it's a little bit late to be seeking advice. They really should seek the advice before they sign. And if they do have an attorney on record, then we're going to put that attorney's information and their contact information here in the body of the contract. And that's it. That's the end of the contract. So page 9, here's where we put the effective date. That means the date that the contract was completely signed and initialed by all parties. This page of the contract only contains 2 things: effective date, signatures. Signatures of buyer and seller. Once the signatures are there, that's really the end of the contract. There are 2 additional pages. That page 10, where we put our information. And of course, way we fill it out depends on who we are in the transaction. One thing that I will point out that we run into a lot, whichever side of the transaction you're on, buyer side, seller side, licensed supervisor of the associate, it is always Marty. Every single time, never me, it's Marty. Marty is the licensed supervisor when it comes to transactions and contracts. I am designated supervisor when it comes to assisting you, but I am not listed on the contract. Don't put me on the contract because they're going to kick it out. It needs to be Marty, and it also needs to be his license number, which is 804082 and now -B. 804082-B. But always put Marty's name on there, not mine. If we're being paid by the listing broker, there's where that's going to go. And then, of course, it's also going to have to be with a 2402. Elba, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt because I
No,
know
you're good. You're good.
As far as for Marty's a license and the office, would that the address would be the Southwest or what address would that be?
Yeah, it's the main office, the
main
1001 West Loop South, number
West
105, Houston 77027.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing. All right, that pretty much got us through. I'm sorry, but we're a couple minutes past time, but we did get through it. Anybody have any questions or on anything before we call it and go eat dinner? All right. Well, in that case, I am going to stop our recording.